From 1958, that was Jan and Arnie with their number 8 hit, Jenny Lee. Jan Berry would soon team up with his pal Dean Torrance to continue in that style for a little while before they flourished in the early to mid-60s as Jan and Dean. Their musical legacy is given the deluxe treatment in an in-depth book called The Jan and Dean Record, a chronology of studio sessions, live performances, and chart positions, by our guest today, author and researcher Mark A. Moore. Mark, welcome to the show. And the music of Jan and Dean encompasses so many different styles and genres and artistic sensibilities. They really were ahead of their time, weren't they?
Yeah, they were, and they started with the doo-wop with Jan and Arnie. Of course, it was known as R&B then. Doo-wop is a later term, but it was just black R&B music, which was Jan's initial love in terms of rock and roll, and it just branched out from there.
So before we get too deep into the story of Jan and Dean, I think a lot of our listeners might be interested in how Arnie Ginsberg, the Arnie of Jan and Arnie, left the scene and was replaced very quickly with Dean Torrance.
Yeah, with Jan and Arnie, Arnie always had an expiration date, so to speak. Arnie had been in ROTC in high school, and he already had a forthcoming military commitment. He was in the Naval Reserve. And so when Jenny Lee came out, the Santa Monica Evening Outlook made it public right away that Arnie had a forthcoming military commitment. So that's one issue with Arnie. And the other issue with Arnie is that, by the end of 1958, they had done a series of high-profile tours with Frankie Avalon, the Kalin Twins, Link Ray, and they had made several national television appearances, Dick Clark Saturday Night Beach Nut Show, Jack Benny program. So they made a big splash, but by the end of the year, Arnie was pretty much disillusioned with the music business. He didn't care for the seedier aspect of it. They got up around Oakland where they saw Lou Adler for the first time. This was before they worked with Lou Adler, or Jan did. And, he just saw the drug circles and just didn't care for it. And he was intimidated to some degree because he didn't feel like he was talented enough. So that being said, regardless of how Arnie felt, the military commitment would have always ended it. And so Dean had been in the reserves between March and September of 58. And when he came home, that sort of coincided with Arnie going his separate way. And Dean had been in the fold all along anyway. The singing group, the Barons with Jan, they were friends. They were all friends, Arnie, Jan, Dean. And so it was just a natural fit for Jan to choose Dean to continue.
Jan and Dean with their 1961 hit version of Heart and Soul. Our guest today is author Mark A. Moore. His book, The Jan and Dean Record, is a scholarly look at the duo's career. And I think until very recently, maybe with the publication of your book, Jan and Dean's music, and specifically Jan Berry as a songwriter, arranger, and producer, has been overlooked and not taken seriously outside of a brief bit of Jan and Dean mania in the 1970s.
Yeah, the Rolling Stone article that Paul Morantz wrote came out in 74, and that was the first big press coverage post-accident for Jan, and that article eventually inspired the television movie in 78.
Well, that TV movie, as good as it is, just scratched the surface of their story, and I think you've gone some ways to put the focus back on Jan Berry as an artist to be reckoned with. Now, the detail in this book is just staggering in terms of session information, who did what, when, and how. I mean, collating all this information must have been extremely difficult. I mean, just tracking it all down after all these years had to have been ridiculously hard.
Well, it was a long, drawn-out process, but I had a couple of really good sources. The first was Jan Berry's archive, of course, and then there were several others, actually. There was the AFM archive in Los Angeles and the tape box inventory at Capitol EMI, which is Universal now. So, yeah, I mean, those are all really important repositories, I guess you'd say, and really went a long way to get me where I needed to be.
I'm also impressed with all of the tour date information in here. I guess you had to go through newspaper archives or old music magazines?
Yeah, some of it comes from Jan's documentation, like their final tour or series of tours, I guess you could say, one-night stands on a lot of times. that's all in Jan's documentation. I have all that stuff. And then, like you said, a part of it is going through newspaper archives. And the general consensus is that Jan and Dean never toured much. And compared to bands like the Beach Boys, they didn't. But they actually performed a lot more than you would think for part-time college students who are moonlighting as rock and roll stars. Right. And so I knew that I wanted to have those in there for context in conjunction with the studio sessions and all of that. But I also knew that I'd never be able to find them all.
Right.
And so, it's a good representation of their concerts, what's in the book, but it's not every single appearance or show or concert that they did in the 60s, but it's a lot of them.
And speaking of live performances, Liberty Records released a quasi-live Jan and Dean album called Fillet of Soul, a live one. Fillet of Soul being a parody of the title Rubber Soul by the Beatles. And there's always been some confusion over this record. Now, Jan Berry had his horrific car accident in April of 1966, and around that time, this album came out, and the cover sports a photo of Jan on crutches, leading some to believe that his accident wasn't that serious. Of course, we now know that it was really serious. What can you tell us about this album and this cover photo?
Yes, in August 1965, they were shooting a movie called Easy Come, Easy Go. It was their own feature film. It was a train accident, and he got hurt. And then, of course, the pilot they shot in late 65, early 66, called On the Run, Jan's in the cast throughout that whole thing. And so that's where it first started in terms of that imagery with Jan's cast. The Fillet of Soul record was an interesting thing. Jan and Dean in December 1965, they were the headliners for the grand opening of the Hullabaloo nightclub, which had been the Moulin Rouge before that, a really ritzy club with the center revolving stage and just a nice place. And they reopened it as a posh nightclub for teens called Dave Hull's Hullabaloo. And so Jan and Dean were the headliners for that, and they recorded 2 concerts. And ostensibly for a live album, but they had already done a live album called Command Performance, which had been recorded in 64, released early 65. And so Jan and Dean figured they'd take it in a different direction. And they started grafting, all these sound effects onto it, sound collage, kind of a deconstructionist, avant-garde, anarchic strangeness is what it was. And the record company, of course, didn't like it. So they told Dean and Jan, knock all that stuff out and just do the record like it would normally be done. And they didn't want to do that. And so they put that aside. They worked on the Batman album. That's why Batman has a different catalog number. And then Jan had the accident, and then they actually put together the album in its release form before the accident, but Jan wasn't working with him. He stopped working with him on it. And so, it just sort of stewed there. Jan had the accident, and then Liberty put the album out, just the live tracks. Then they grafted a couple of studio tracks on there, like a version of Dead Man's Curve and stuff. Gonna Hustle You from 63, that was the first debut of that. And so just a strange mix there. And so the album in its release form wasn't what Jan and Dean would have wanted.
We're talking with Mark A. Moore, author of the Jan and Dean record. I'd like to ask about 2 lost Jan and Dean albums recorded post-accident, but not released. Save for a Rainy Day, which is really just Dean on his own, trying to get some product out there while Jan recuperates. And the album that Jan started before the accident, or at least recorded tracks for it prior to the accident, Carnival of Sound.
Yeah, Save for a Rainy Day came first in November of 66, and it was self-released by Dean on what he called the J&D Record Company label. That was his attempt to keep the Jan and Dean name going, and he was on the right track. Really had, got a good thing going there, really top-flight musicians. The music has this moody, atmospheric, almost melancholic aspect to it in a lot of ways. And really off to a good start there to try to keep Jan and Dean's name out there as things were changing. 67 was the Summer of Love and all that.
Right.
But unfortunately, Dean didn't have the authority to release anything like that. Couldn't use the name Jan and Dean. couldn't have a J&D record company label or anything like that. And so Screen Gems killed that, and it was dead on arrival, essentially. And the same thing happened when Dean tried to take that to Columbia after his self-released endeavor. He made a deal with Columbia that Screen Gems also killed because, again, Dean just didn't have the authority to use the name or to make business dealings. And so all that's why Save for a Rainy Day never came out.
Do you have a favorite cut from that time period we can play?
For Save for a Rainy Day, I would choose Yellow Balloon, Dean's second version, which he calls Turtlesque. Gary Zeekley, who wrote the song, didn't like Dean's version. He knew Dean was working on a version, and so he rushed out. He got the Ron Hecklin singers together, and he rushed out a version that they released under the band name Yellow Balloon. And it was actually on the charts at the same time of Jan and Dean's version, which was by Dean Torrance.
From 1964, Jan and Dean with the title song for the Shelley Fabares movie, Ride the Wild Surf. So, as we established, Jan has this car accident in April of 1966, and as a result of serious brain trauma, he basically has to learn how to live all over again. But remarkably, 1 year later, he's back in the studio trying to complete the next Jan and Dean album, which is called Carnival of Sound, but it never comes out.
Yeah, 1 year to the month after the accident, April of 67, Jan was back in the studio. He couldn't sing yet, but he was working with collaborators, songwriting collaborators and arranging collaborators. All those contracts with Screen Gems from before the accident remained active after the accident. And so they put everything on hold until he was ready to go back in the studio. Then they picked it right back up. He started making those tracks, Hawaii, Fantan, Love and Hate, stuff like that would eventually be on Carnival of Sound or, be slated for Carnival of Sound. And it was shelved because he had an impulse disorder after the accident. And so, every time he would get a good thing going, everything's lined up business-wise, his collaborators, his father was his conservator who ran everything business-wise. Everybody get on the same page, and then Jan would blow it up without meaning to because he would make calls to the studio heads and just try to, make plans without, or I guess you'd say kind of acting in detail, but yet not having a plan like he did before the accident, which was he was really good at working the studio system before the accident. But afterwards, it just wasn't the same. And so that was a problem, and it got to the point where Screen Gems finally ended the contract in August of 68. Those two albums, Save for a Rainy Day, Carnival of Sound, spent all those years in obscurity getting bootlegged and what have you, simply because, low-quality bootlegs, I should say, for the most part. And simply because that stuff was shelved by Screen Gems, essentially, they killed it all. Except, they didn't kill Carnival of Sound, so to speak. They just kind of ended the contract.
Well, that's really a shame because Carnival of Sound is actually one of my favorite Jan and Dean albums. Now, of course, we've gotten to hear this material over the years with CD archive releases, but boy, if that had come out, that's just a great Jan and Dean album. Well,
there's some really good stuff on there. It also has the oldies, so to speak, Stay, Yakety Yak, and stuff like that, which are, the reason they use those are Jan had been tinkering with that stuff again in the months prior to the accident, and those tracks were already in the can. And Jan's post-accident condition made it such that he was really slow in getting things done in the studio. He wasn't as controlled as he had been before the accident. And he ran up these astronomical bills in the studio. And so they said, well, these other tracks are already done, so let's just use those. And so that's why those oldies are kind of meshed onto the album and they don't really fit.
Right.
But as far as the other stuff, Girl, You're Blowing My Mind was begun. The first sessions for that were before the accident. So when you think about it that way, Girl, You're Blowing My Mind kind of represents the best picture we have of where Jan was going to take the music before the accident.
And I didn't realize this until I read your book. Jan Berry is not singing on this album. Like you said, he wasn't able to sing at this point after his accident, so they got Glenn Campbell to come in and basically do an imitation of Jan Berry, and my God, I mean, he nails it. He sounds just like him.
Yes. What they did was, the studio singers, it was Ron Hicklin's quartet and some other people, and Glenn Campbell, and like for Hawaii, Fantan, Love and Hate, Glenn is also singing on those records, and they did like a composite lead vocal blend to kind of make it sound like a pre-accident Jan Berry vocal.
Right.
And it's very similar. And then with Girl, You're Blowing My Mind, Glenn did sort of a similar thing. He's the vocalist on that. But, Glenn, of course, had played guitar on a lot of stuff of Jan and Dean's pre-accident because of the Wrecking Crew. But he also plays guitar on it, and he sings a lot on it, whether leads or backing vocals.
Just incredible stuff. We're talking with Mark A. Moore, author of the book The Jan and Dean Record, a chronology of studio sessions, live performances, and chart positions. And the story of Jan Berry, well, the story of Jan and Dean, doesn't end with the aborted Carnival of Sound album. I mean, Jan kept on going, trying to write, arrange, and produce. Yeah, he still had the creative spark. I mean, all through the 1970s, he had a solo career on Ode Records and A&M Records. He co-wrote, co-produced, and released singles for those labels, which were facilitated by Lou Adler. And in the 80s, they also, they continued to record in the 80s, Jan and Dean. They had Ocean Park Angel in the 80s. Jan did a cassette single with the Aloha Band, which was Jan's band, called Rock City. And, stuff like that. And they had the Port to Paradise release in the 80s. So, yeah, he was always, wanting to keep a hand in the studio, keep a hand on the creative flow, and always hoping for something big. Mark, where can people go to get your book?
Well, it's available through the publisher, McFarland. I think it's McFarlandBooks.com, and, of course, Amazon.com. And
what about catching up with you online or what you're doing online?
Yeah, there's a Facebook page for the book. It's just Jan and Dean Record, the Jan and Dean Record. And Jan Berry has a website, jananddean-janberry.com. There's a message board there, and that's pretty much it.
All right. Well, Mark, thanks so much for appearing on the show. Once again, the book is just incredible.
Well, I appreciate it. Yeah, it was a great project, and it took forever, but glad it's finally out.
Thanks so much, Mark. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. My pleasure.